If you were here last week, you heard Tim talk about our worst moments and how God's grace abounds even at our worst. And he was talking about his family, and it kind of reminds me of the episode from Homer Simpsons where his family was about to go to this big party, and right outside the door, he gets them in a huddle, and he says this. Now remember, as far as everyone else is concerned, we are a nice, normal family. I had many of these moments, but there is a better hope. And that is found in our text, Acts 23. So if you will turn there with me in your Pew Bible, it is page 932. Page 932. 932. And we are going to be reading, I'm going to be reading, and I'm going to ask you to stand with me as I read, verse 12 to the end of chapter. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. So he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them. For more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote the letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And it was disclosed to me that there will be a plot against the man. I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commended him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. That's a lot of text. I'm not used to plotting through this much scripture at one setting. But rather than getting lost in the details, let's take a step back and focus on the larger context. When I'm overwhelmed with a lot of information, I need to see the larger picture. Well, what is the larger picture here? In one word, it's providence. Providence. By providence, I mean God's management of the world for our good, and I may add, in spite of us. A good place to start here is to keep in mind Luke's intentional parallel between Paul's suffering in the book of Acts and Jesus' suffering in his gospel. We heard Pastor Tim talk about this. Both Jesus and Paul set their faces towards Jerusalem, if you remember that. They both set out resolutely against the advice of their companions because they were both driven by the strong, a profound sense of mission. And both of them were seized and tried, by one account, 5 times each. And both were charged by the Jews and found innocent by the Romans. But now, through all of that, neither of them were just a victim of an unfortunate series of events. You see, their suffering was deep, but not tragic, because of that one word, providence. Providence. And that's also what Acts chapter 23, verse 11 is all about. When Jesus says to Paul, and we saw this at the end of last week, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Now, if you want to know where the rest of the story is going, you only need to remember this one verse. You see, no matter how unlikely, how impossible, no matter who or what is in the way, that's the destination. Providence. And that's the bird's eye view from 30,000 feet. But life is not really lived from 30,000 feet, is it? It always feels completely different at the ground level. So what does it feel like? Well, a little thought experiment. Imagine you're 12, 13, or 15. Now, some of you are there. The rest of you kind of put yourself in their shoes. So you think you begin to have an idea what life is going. Kind of. Then imagine out of the blue, you're orphaned. Mom and dad are gone. Your relatives are nowhere to be found. You are literally on your own. And all of a sudden, you have to make ends meet, not just for yourself, but also for your younger siblings, to be the shoulder for them to cry down. Right? All while you yourself still have to figure everything out. Can you feel that stress and that anxiety? Well, that's what life often feels like at the ground level. But I don't have to be an actual orphan to feel it. See, many of us already, we operate with the mentality that I am all I've got. Now, even those of us who say that we believe in a good Heavenly Father, we still experience many orphan moments, don't we? Because functionally, we have been conditioned to see and hear and obsess with the problems of life in eternal vision. Just think about the number of things we fear. The number of things we fear. Severe weather events. Loss of job. Loss of income. Loss of loved ones. The fear of big government. Small government. Corrupt government. Government that is too conservative or too progressive. AI. Bills. Taxes. Car trouble. House trouble. Fear of crowds. Fear of being alone. Fear of noises. Fear of silence. Disease. Illness. Aging. And death. We're not talking about clinical phobias. Just everyday events that raise our blood pressure and make us panic. Texts from Elaine. Now, if I learned anything from the pandemic or the recent Chester County prison escape, it's that our modern life is in a perpetual state of emergency. We are constantly bracing for one catastrophe to the next. Now, if we approach our text from the same ground level, what we are going to see is a kind of power struggle between two powerful groups of people. The Jewish zealot on one hand, but also the Roman officials, one religious and one military civil. And Paul is caught in between these two powers in a position of weakness. One is dead set on his demise. The other one is dead set preventing an uprising. If you read it like you read the news on your phone, you may just feel your blood pressure rising and your adrenaline pumping. So first, there's a conspiracy, a plot. And we know about conspiracy, don't we? Verse 12 to 15. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council," that is the Sanhedrin, "give notice to the tribune to bring him down to us as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now, there have been multiple attempts on Paul's life before this. Now, more than 40 men had decided it was time for the religious nuclear option. Now, I know that we're talking about murder and ambush and deception, but I'm guessing that in their minds, they believe they're doing the right thing, the necessary thing, and with maximum amount of power at their disposal. Now, what do you mean? Well, these are religious people. And the fact that they explained their plan to the religious leader and recruited them. Both the chief priest and the Sanhedrin is part of their plan. That tells me that they saw nothing wrong in what they were doing, however convoluted their justification might be. I'm reminded that we as human beings, and that includes all of us who are religious, we have almost infinite capacity to rationalize sin. The main thing to keep in mind here is that their solemn oath is more than just a show of determination. I think this is their way of invoking as much power as they know how. These are religious Jews, steeped in all the traditions and practices of their religiosity. To bind themselves under a curse with a complete fast, it's kind of their way of making sure that God is on their side. They all in. Maximum power. Now, how does Luke know all this? Well, he has a source. Verse 16. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of the ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." So this plot was discovered by a nameless nephew from a sister we didn't know Paul had, and never to be heard again. I have so many questions, don't you? But just like life lived at the ground level, there are often no answers. Strangers showed up out of nowhere, things happen, along with total surprises and mysteries. That's what we have here. And then verse 19. The tribune took him by the hand, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him, but do not be persuaded by them. For more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things. So how does a Roman tribune respond to power, even power in secrecy? Well, with even more power. Of course, verse 23, then he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. It's about 9 o'clock at night. So they travel all night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. Now, there's a debate about the word spearman in Greek. Some scholars think this is lightly armed auxiliary troops. Now, some think it's just extra horses. We don't know for sure. But we're talking about at least 200 infantry, 70 cavalry, and 200 more of whatever. If that seems excessive to protect one prisoner, that might be the point, right? The word tribune is literally a commander of 1,000, at least on paper. Realistically, the conservative estimate is that he has about 600 or so soldiers under his command. In other words, he emptied about half of his garrison to escort Paul through the night. Now, this is more than adequate security. This is maximum deterrent. Power against power. Power that says, don't even think about this. So why is he doing this? What is this really about? Well, verse 25. He wrote the letter to the effect. Claudius Lysias. Now here we hear his name for the first time, and it befits a Greek, because he has a Greek name, Lysias, who bought Roman citizenship, and he now uses Claudius, the emperor's name, in honor of the emperor. To His Excellency, the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there will be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. Now, if you want a free lesson in politics, you should study this letter very carefully. There's a lot of skills involved. Everything he said was technically correct, right? With the perfect amount of subtle embellishment that casts him in the best possible light. Now, he is the subject of 9 action verbs. I came upon him. I rescued him. I did this, I did that. Having learned that he was a Roman citizen, well, never mind that he was told about that, post-Roman citizenship, after the fact. And after, if you compare the text before this, after he was about to torture him. Without a charge. So all the desperate chaos of the moment was transformed into this perfect backdrop for him to shine. He was calm. He was competent. He was able to navigate around a Jewish religious mess to uphold Roman justice. Now, reading this, I was like, man, Felix, the governor, was so lucky to have this man as his subordinate. Rome was so lucky to have Lysias. Kind of like the governor of Pennsylvania after the collapse of 95 and Chester County president escaped. We were all like, wow, Pennsylvania was so lucky to have him. That's what this is. Now, whether or not he actually cares about Paul as a person, well, I'm not saying that he does or doesn't, because that's beside the point. This puts the ball in Felix's court, who can't afford to underperform his subordinate. So verse 31. So the soldiers, according to the instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. So the cavalry went on. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. That's the palace. So after Felix checks to make sure that Paul was indeed under his jurisdiction, he begins a process that will set in motion Paul's path all the way to Rome. Now, this is the view of life at the ground level. But that's only a partial perspective. Now, you say, what's a full perspective? Well, Luke was part of the apostolic community that had experienced the providence of God in a unique, I would say uniquely profound and firsthand kind of way. And part of their foundational theological underpinning, had already been articulated, if you pay attention, by Peter in his message, his sermon about Jesus. And so I want to kind of take you back to Acts chapter 2, verse 22. And this had been their theology all along, as they learned about God. Acts 2:22. Men of Israel, says Peter, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs, that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, that's the view from the 30,000 feet. You crucified and killed him by the hands of lawless men, and that's life at the ground level. God's plan and our action. God's total sovereignty and human responsibility in a single verse. Now remember, Luke parallels Paul's suffering with Jesus' suffering. So if this was true of Jesus, it by extension is also true of Paul. Now this brings us forward to Acts 23, verse 11, which really sets up our entire passage. Acts 23, verse 11, Jesus says to Paul, take courage. Take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, you must testify also in Rome. Yes, people plot. Yes, people scheme. And yes, you're weak. And yes, you're caught in between. But all of that is part of the plan. You must also testify in Rome. Providence. Now, as we bring this fuller perspective together, I want to point out three things that I think will help us drink deeply from providence. Number one, providence is both God's sovereignty and people's choices. Now, I want to begin here because I know that a lot of us, we get hung up on this paradox. So I want you to forget for a moment all the schools of arguments about this and just kind of focus on the tension that is there in that single verse, Acts 2:23. 2:23. This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Now, if it's God's definite plan all along, by the way, God's foreknowledge here in the Bible, it is more than just God's ability to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. The Bible tells us that God is not simply responding or reacting to our future choices. His control is actually total. Now, if you want to know any more about this and want to get more answers, this Pastor Tim is right there. But if it is God's definite plan all along, then how can God still hold the men of Jerusalem responsible? You crucified, you killed. Well, that's the question of free will, isn't it? If God has total control, then, even over our actions, God has total control. If that is true, then how can we still have free will? And if we don't have free will, then how can we be held responsible? Can you believe that the Bible contains such a flagrant contradiction here in a single verse? It's God's plan, but we're still responsible. Are we reading this right? What are we supposed to do with this? So, you can understand why we try to smooth this out over history. Okay, so we try to smooth this out by downplaying one end or the other. But let's be honest here, okay? The tension is there. And the tension is there in Genesis when God chooses some people and not choose the other. In Exodus, in Isaiah, in Romans, and in the rest of the Bible, the biblical author didn't really smooth this tension out because their goal wasn't to create an understandable God. Rather, they encounter the real God who reveals himself often in ways that we don't understand. God is so far beyond our ideas about him. I really like what one theologian says. He says, he's beyond all our ideas about his being beyond our ideas. That is actually the key to see why the problem is on our side and not on the Bible side. So very quickly, let me draw an analogy for math. Now, I throw this math lesson in for free, okay? Infinity minus any real number, however large, here represented by x, still equals to itself. Now, how can that be, right? Think about this. This is true even if x is a mind-boggling number. Say Google. That's 10 to the power of 100. Say a Google. Now, that's mind-boggling, but how can that be, right? How can that be? This equation doesn't make any sense for any other finite numbers. I know Andrew knows this. He's the accountant. He's way back there, but he understands this, right? Well, infinity isn't just any other finite numbers. It is different. It alone is set apart. It's wholly other. Now, this is very much like what happens when you bring God's total control together with our limited free will. Now, think of God's total control as unlimited or infinite. The reason why we feel the tension between God's sovereignty and our free will is because we see that the more God is sovereign, the less we have free will. And this is true for anything within nature. For any finite number, the more control our government has, the less freedom is left for the people. The more control our teacher has in the classroom, the less choices people really have or students have in the classroom. One must be subtracted from the other. But God is not like any finite number or creature. He's not part of creation. He stands outside. He is the holy other. So if you think God's total control as infinite, then however much free will he grants us, as long as it is finite, he remains in total control. And even though our free will is finite, it is genuinely free. And so God can, and he does, hold us responsible. The logic problem is on our side. It's not on the Bible side. And the key is the holiness of God. Consider what Eugene Peterson says, the late Presbyterian preacher. He says, holy is a word that sets something apart. That which is holy is not derived from something we are or have. It cannot be related to something we know. It is other than. It comes from outside, God is not a projection of our imaginations, nor wish fulfillment, not a childish fantasy. God is holy. So back to the cross chart. If you remember the cross chart, right, on the top. God is holier than we can ever imagine. Now, once we get clear about God, we're ready to get clear about providence, especially the part that is counterintuitive. So number 2, providence transforms power in an upside-down kind of way. It's not the way we expect it to. Verse 11. Back to what Jesus said. Now here, I want to remind you of Paul's helplessness in all of this when Jesus spoke these words to him. Paul is trapped between two powerful forces of his world. On the one side is the mob of religious men who binds themselves with a solemn oath to kill him. On the other side is a Roman tribune with soldiers to protect his self-interest. Both sides are flexing their muscles. Now, what does Paul have? Not muscle, right? He's unarmed. He's totally vulnerable. No friends in the whole of power. No connection. And he just messed up his one opportunity by cursing the high priest out, as we seen last week. So imagine this. He came to Jerusalem with a small band of friends, almost nothing. And it still went downhill from there. But now look at him. But now what happens? He leaves Jerusalem with a small army protecting him, a horse under him. In fact, multiple mounts for him, apparently. And the palace is his destination. Now, I don't think you can buy that, even if you had the money. Providence. Behind all the activities, all the twists and turns of human maneuvers and counter-maneuvers, lies the almost completely imperceptible, but completely powerful, immutable, and impervious sovereignty of God. Now, we often think of providence means that we will grow more and more powerful and influential in order to serve God's purposes. But the pattern here in Paul's life is that God delights in using our helplessness, our weakness. Blessed are the poor in the spirit and the meek. Often we're tempted to be enamored with power. We want to be in the whole of power, to garner power against power in order to do good. That's our idea. But providence means that God often has to empty us about power in order to do his thing. And from the ground level where we live our life, now this feels completely uncomfortable to me and unsafe, which brings us to number 3. Number 3, providence simplifies. Now let me set this up. Providence simplifies. Jesus' words to Paul are, take courage. Take courage. Now this is reminiscent of all the Old Testament passages where God told his people, do not be afraid, do not fear, but take courage. With all the things we naturally fear, the Bible tells us that we have only one person to fear, God. That's it. That's why providence simplifies. I'm stealing this from Michael Horton, a faculty in Westminster Theological Seminary. He wrote a book called Recovering Our Sanity. And the thesis of his entire book is this: the fear of God drives out the fear of everything else. You see, the antidote to our fears is not our power. It's not we have more influence. It's not about our plans or our information or insurance. The antidote is the fear of God. You see, there's a pandemic of fear in our modern life. But we can't displace that fear with the absence of fear. Instead, it must be displaced by a different kind of fear. Only the proper fear of God can ultimately drive out the fear of failure, the fear of people, the fear of future, the fear of illness, of loss, of unhappiness, of discomfort, of aging, of even death itself. Now, this is not the shuddering kind of a fear that demons have before Jesus, but a transformed kind of fear that drives us to God. A kind of sublime awe, a kind of sublime awe of that holy author that makes us fall on our knee before him, and then also at the same time drives us to cling to him. All on the account of that big cross. Think of the cross chart. There's real fear. But this fear is not about anxiety and shame, but a kind of trembling about the perfection, the beauty, and the undeserved grace of the gospel. There's awe. There's something sublime about that. To know God who's totally sovereign, who's both the judge and the justifier of sinners, who delights in and transforms our helplessness. To know him, to know that God drives out all the other fears. And that's what Jesus is saying to Paul. Are you afraid, Paul? Are you afraid you've messed up? Are you afraid you missed the boat to Rome? Are you afraid you failed me? Are you afraid you miss all the signs and opportunities to do my will? You know, people may plot. People may scheme. People act and react. They cope, they manage, they disrupt with all kinds of determination and rationalization and manipulation. But at the end of the day, they only serve my purposes. Nothing more, nothing less. You must testify also in Rome. Take courage. Let's pray. Father, help us to enter your presence in a real, profound way, that we may understand and experience what it is to be in the presence of one who is in total control, even over the hearts of people, that we may have that proper fear, redeemed and transformed by Christ, no longer about shame and guilt, but trembling at the perfection and undeserved grace of your gospel. So that holy fear, now transformed by your love, will drive out all our other fears. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.